Hi, everyone who's coming in. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes to give everyone a chance to get here. Okay, well, I think we'll just get started and people can enter as they arrive. Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Lucy Handley, the Adult Programs Coordinator at the Ridgefield Library, on behalf of which I thank you for coming. Welcome to the third event in our series, What Does the First Amendment Mean Today? Next event will be on Sunday, the 10th at 5 o'clock. It's an in-person panel discussion, which will also be hybrid. And the panelists will be Akil Amar from Yale, Mike McIntyre, New York Times journalist, Nadine Strawson, past president of the ACLU, and Brenda McKinley, our library director. Now I'd like to introduce Marilyn Carroll, the president of the Ridgefield League of Women Voters, a valued partner with the library and the community. Marilyn will now introduce our honored speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And it is indeed my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gloria J. Browne-Marshall, who is a writer, civil rights attorney, award-winning playwright, and professor of constitutional law at John Jay College. Dr. Browne-Marshall also taught in the Africana Studies program at Vassar College. Prior to academia, Dr. Browne-Marshall litigated cases for the Southern Poverty Law Center, Community Legal Services, and NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She is the author of She Took Justice, The Black Woman, Law and Power, 1619 to 1969, Race, Law, and American Society, 1607 to present, The Voting Rights War, and the Constitution, Major Cases and Conflicts. Her virtual stage play, Dreams of Emmett Till, which I highly recommend, won the American Film Award for Short Film and the Best Experimental Film at the Cannes Independent Film Festival. It is an official selection at the Chi-Town Multicultural Film Festival, slated for November 5th, 2021. Dr. Browne-Marshall is a recipient of many, and I mean many, awards, including a Pulitzer Center grant and Frederick Lewis Allen Fellowship. She speaks nationally and internationally about her books, the Constitution, and issues of social justice. We are indeed fortunate to have such a distinguished constitutional scholar and legal historian speak to us today about one of the First Amendment 5 freedoms, the right of the people to peaceably assembly. And now I shall turn it over to you, Dr. Browne-Marshall. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And with all of that, I totally appreciate being here, but I have lots of skills. Technology is not of the highest one of my skills, and I will try to handle a lecture and a PowerPoint on Zoom without disaster. So that's my attempt. And if I fail in any way, please forgive me on this Sunday. Freedom of assembly. And for many people who are Constitution geeks, freedom of assembly is not one of the top ones. And the reason why it's not one of the top freedoms is because it's probably not seen as one of the sexier freedoms, like freedom of speech or freedom of the press. However, it's something that we take for granted every single day, and the ability to come together in groups. and groups in person. And something that, when you think not just from 1787 when the Constitution was drafted, and 1791 when the Bill of Rights, of course, was drafted and ratified, and freedom of assembly was part of the First Amendment of the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, or to the Constitution. We had, even before that, this sense of how one can gather, and even the reason why so many immigrants have come to this country from its very inception to this day is because of this issue around gathering with people of like mind, especially if the government was not approving of that gathering or approving of what was being discussed by those people. So let's start off with where it's located in the Constitution. As stated before in the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, that we know that is the Establishment Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the Free Exercise Clause, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. When we think about this, we have to think about this freedom of assembly to come together peaceably is what's required under the Constitution. But we know most assemblies are peaceable assemblies, but of course there are others that are not, or maybe because by their very essence, they're seen as in some way a threat to the neighborhood, the community, or to the government itself. And that would include protest. So there are different types of assembly. And of course, when you gather around the dinner table, that is an assembly. When you participate in other activities of interest to you in the library or with friends, that's an assembly. Coming together in any way. So assembly is seen as from a very broad standpoint as far as its definition. However, when it becomes focused in a particular way based on the topic or content or substance of that assembly, then we go into another area. And so I'm going to look at protest, participation in religion, and freedom of association as those three major areas of freedom of assembly. And so freedom to assemble, to participate in religious activities is guaranteed under the Free Exercise Clause. And that's why I wanted us to make sure that we saw what were these 5 freedoms within the First Amendment, and to see the Free Exercise Clause from the difference between that and the Establishment Clause is pretty simple. And someone's, I'm sure, is going to talk about freedom of religion in more detail. But the Free Exercise Clause allows one to assemble in synagogue, church, community center for their right to practice the religion of their choice, or not to practice a religion of their choice. It could be a communing with nature that would be part of this exercise that they consider to be religion. Whatever it is, it doesn't have to be a religion that's established under our government or established in a way that's a 501c4 or any type of governmental stamp that's been placed on that religion. It's a way in which people want to come together. You know, and you think about it on this Sunday, wherever 2 or more are gathered in my name, there am I also, as it states in the Bible. But it's also one in which people can come together and decide that they just want to join and discuss religious practices. But whatever it may be, it could be a fact that they are trying to decide what kind of religion that they want it to be. Whatever the freedom of the exercise of their religion is protected, but, and there's always a but, because under the Constitution, all rights are balanced. So you have individual rights, one individual's rights balanced with another individual's rights. You have the balance between an individual and the government, whether or not that's state, local, or federal government. So that individual's right is really balanced with the rights of the government. And for example, if one wanted to practice their religion by walking up the major highway and blocking that traffic, their individual right to practice their religion has now interfered with the ability of the government to maintain order. For people to go where they want to go, they're blocking the street, they're causing disorder. And so therefore, their freedom of religion is going to be undermined. Their association on the street or on that highway now has gone beyond the bounds of what is in the balance of things the government is going to recognize as an individual right. So when people look at the rights in the Constitution, it's very rare that any right has is limitless or has the ability to supersede the rights of all others. And so that goes with the freedom of assembly as well. If that assembly is taking place, for example, in a school after school hours are closed, or in a business, you begin to see how that right of the business to close when they want to close, the right of the people in a school to decide who will be able to have access to that public or private property, then you see encroaches on what someone may believe can be the right that they can assemble. So now we get to Skokie, Illinois. In Skokie, Illinois, we have a community in Skokie at that time in 1977 was a very a community that was very religious. It was a Jewish community, and many of the people in the community had religious connections to the Jewish faith, or they had people who had actually survived the Nazi Germany. And so those people minding their own business in this suburban community were then thrust into history. Why? Because neo-Nazis decided they wanted to have the right to assemble during this time period in 1977 and walk through this very a population of connected with Jewish faith, or even connected with those who have survived the concentration camps and survived Nazi Germany. This issue becomes one in which those people who want to freely associate are, of course, question why, of all the places, would you want to, as a neo-Nazi organization, want to associate here in Skokie, Illinois, where they wanted to raise their, some people have said, their own prominence, and receive the attention. Well, of course, then they did, because here we are in 2021 still talking about this case. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, actually supported the right of freedom of assembly of these neo-Nazis to participate in a march through Skokie, Illinois. In the end, the neo-Nazis chose not to participate in that type of march and to gather, in another place downtown and near Skokie, but it's already set the precedent. And the ACLU, of course, came under bitter criticism for supporting this. I mean, ACLU, considered a very liberal organization when it came to civil liberties, said, no, it's not about being liberal. It's about protecting the right of freedom of assembly and freedom of association. And so they believed that to protect the rights of the neo-Nazis would be protecting the rights of all those people to believe in freedom of assembly, even if it went against the sensibilities of the communities in which they were assembling. So protest rights. And I'm going to spend a great deal of time on protest rights because the right to protest, the word protest, is not in the Constitution. There is no word protest in the Constitution itself or in the amendments. We gain our protest rights through the right of freedom of speech in the First Amendment, of the press, because one can use the press to protest or put their grievances in a newspaper or a magazine. But the people to assemble to now protest or to put forth their grievances. And then the last line of the Constitution, I think many people really overlook this. And I think it's very important for us to understand that we have the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It's right there, the last line of the First Amendment. The right to petition, ask the government for a redress or a remedy, a change of grievances or complaints. And so when we assemble to then not just discuss among ourselves what these grievances are that we want the government to redress, but also how we're going to get the government's attention to make sure the government understands that these grievances are very important to us as citizens or people who believe that their rights have been ignored, or there are certain grievances they believe that the government needs to address. Coming together now, assembling, and in that assembling, putting forward those demands, those grievances, That is what we, of course, have known to be our protest rights. And this country was born of protest. And I want to go through some of the protests that this country has seen and survived. And then at the end, I want to go to freedom of association. And freedom of association is one of those rights that comes under the right to assemble. Because when you think about the ability to assemble and assemble around a particular substantive topic, then that association, that grouping, whether or not it's an organization or a loosely contained group, that is our right of freedom of association. But I want to get to that after I go through a protest. So when we get to our protest rights, we have those protest rights, but and once again, here's that balance. We can protest against the government. We can protest against private citizens who we believe, are not addressing a cause we feel that they should address. You see protests against particular store chains, protests against actions of individuals because we believe that those people are acting the way that's racist or sexist or against animals or whatever it might be that is an issue that about which we have grievances. People can come together and assemble and protest. But what if that protest becomes violent? So under the Constitution, we have the right to assemble, as we said, peaceably. And so in that peaceable assembly that's under the Constitution, even there are cases in which even peaceable assembly can be seen as disruptive. And if that peaceable assembly is seen as disruptive, then police officers go from under the Constitution protecting the protesters to protecting the bystanders or even protecting private property. So when there's a risk of harm to people who are bystanders or risk of harm to property, then you see law enforcement comes in to maintain order. However, and I've said this many times, law enforcement is not their own police values enforcement. It's the value or the ideals and the rights under the Constitution that are to be protected and enforced. And so it becomes very subjective. And we've seen this a great deal with Black Lives Matter as opposed to what happened on January 6th. And so January 6th of this year, we know we had an attack on the Capitol. Some people have called it an uprising. Other people have called it protest. But at the end of the day, it was violent. And the police in that particular protest did not use the same amount of, I would say, for the most part, called on by the government under Donald Trump, the same amount of enforcement that was used 3 months before when you had a Black Lives Matter protest and Donald Trump at the time, who was president, decided to use military type dispersal. And in doing so, tear gas, helicopters, sound waves, all these things were used against peaceable assembly, but they were assembled in the streets. And so one can say, well, being assembled in the street meant that they had disrupted the peace. And so therefore, the government could use a type of disbursement that would allow the president of the United States not to feel that he was in any way threatened or any other government officials. But you see the subjectiveness of law enforcement when you're looking at what people are doing and who has this right now to disrupt the peace to a certain degree that they will not get arrested, that perhaps it is a matter of civil disobedience. And so I want to go through a few of these first anti-government protests where we start talking about assembly and assembly as protest. When people are coming together with demands for their government, petitioning the government for a redress of grievances, coming together and making those demands on the government. And so let's begin as early as the Jamestown settlement and the Virginia colony. We know that the Virginia colony was founded in 1607 as the first permanent English settlement in North America. By 1619, Africans arrived in this colony. This colony was founded on the land belonging to the Powhatan Native Americans. And so we have at that time the Powhatan Native Americans, the Europeans, and the Africans in 1619. That same summer of 1619, in August, when the Africans arrived, during July of that summer, the House of Burgesses had met. The House of Burgesses was created in July of 1619 to be the legislative body in the colony, creating the laws that would prohibit or demand certain assemblies. So you think about it, that was the official legislative assembly right there, the House of Burgesses in July of 1619. However, in 1608 and 1609, prior to the creation of the House of Burgesses, there had been a horrible drought. And during this horrible drought, there had also been many attacks by the Powhatans who had grown tired of the presence of the Europeans on their land. And so the Powhatan Native Americans were attacking the fort in Jamestown settlement. And the people inside the fort, because of the drought, had very little food. And so what resulted in that horrible time in 1608 was cannibalism. Yes, cannibalism, and all types of horrific things were taking place within that fort. 2/3 of the population died during that time period. And so when that all ended and there was order restored, there were laws put in place called the divine laws. And the divine laws created requirement that everyone assemble at church. They had to go to church every Sunday. You could not have certain assemblies of people who were thought to be bad people. And so a lot of the actions, the behaviors that were considered those that led to this horrible action that took place within the settlement. They called it, they thought that people had been possessed by the devil and that they had lost their sense of morality. So these divine laws of moral behavior was put in place to prevent people from assembling in ways that they believed would lead to other type of diabolical behavior. And so the House of Burgesses, when they had now the religious laws, they started creating other laws. Little by little, they started to create designated laws based on race and whether or not people of color could assemble. So a lot of the remnants of what we are looking at today with laws around, assembly, whether or not people can loiter, and the fact that loitering is seen as something bad, is the idea that if people aren't busy, then, idle hands are the devil's workshops. And so they don't want loitering. They don't want trespass. There's always this sense that if people are seen together in ways that aren't righteous, either religious or at work, then there must be getting in trouble. And so laws began very early to regulate behaviors outside of the home, where people could go, where they could not go, and with whom they can, find time in which to talk without that sense that if these are Africans, then there must be trouble. They might be, if they're enslaved Africans, they may be planning some type of uprising. And therefore, by 1680, there had been law passed by the House of Burgesses that basically said that Africans could not come together for burials, for feasts, for religious ceremonies, because it was thought that if these Africans came together, they were planning or plotting to overthrow the Europeans. Also, I think was very important is 1676. Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 was a time in which poor white Europeans and Africans came together, and they came together in a way in which they then protested their treatment under the white European elite in the Virginia colony. That was the first time that the Africans and the Europeans had come together, and the grouping was so powerful that laws were passed that would break the bond between the poor or working class Europeans and the Africans, because it was seen as early as 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion, the power of that unity. And so once again, laws are being created to undermine the power of minority groups so that they cannot gain a threshold or at least bond with other groups, and then the power of those groups coming together be a threat to the power elite. As we go forward, we have other times in which, and I'll give you one more, in which the poor or struggling whites were seen as being in cahoots or assembling with Africans, and the threat of that. And that was in 1741. In 1741, there were fires in New York City. And of course, back then, everything was made of wood. And if a fire started, it threatened the whole community. And so these fires were seen as some type of way in which there was an uprising or a disgruntled thoughts by the Africans who were enslaved, as well as the poor whites. And so the responsibilities, the consequences, again, the legal consequences, as I said, back after the Bacon's Rebellion, was to create laws that would build a wedge between the poor whites and the Africans so that they would not come together. In 1741 in New York, the consequences were those Africans who were found based on the whatever evidence or investigations took place during that time, guilty of participating in these protests or fires that took place, were burned alive. They were burned alive in New York City in 1741 and 1742. Laws were again passed to make it illegal for Africans to be in any, who were enslaved, to be in any open area without a pass. And so you had to have a pass that was signed by the slave master saying that these Africans could actually leave their place of work and travel, whether or not far or near, by themselves. Or there were laws that only 2 Africans could be in one place at a time. And there were laws passed that Africans and whites could not, except if they were working together, be together in any type of assembly or be seen talking to one another. And when you go forward, you'll see by 1787, what gives rise to the U.S. Constitution is Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shay in January of 1787, and other farmers who are poor and had served in the Revolutionary War were having their farms repossessed. And so the idea that they were losing their farms, that they did not receive the army or military pensions, and this is before the army, but the military pensions they were due, they began to assemble. And in assembling, they had Daniel Shay, who had been a leader in the Revolutionary War, rise up, and in that rising up begin to not just petition the government to stop taking their farms and sending them into poverty, because without land, these people could not vote, because the law said that only those people who were landholders could vote. So not only would they lose their only way of making a living, but they would also lose their right to have a voice in their communities. And so the Shays' Rebellion is one that showed the weaknesses under the Articles of Confederation, that then gives rise to the coming together for the Constitutional Council and or Constitutional well, it wasn't a constitution then, but the Articles of Confederation, the fact that James Madison wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, they found they couldn't amend it in order to protect the country as a whole from these types of uprisings like Shays' Rebellion. And so it's there that we give rise then to the Constitution we have today in that summer of 1787, but also to the individual rights that are part of the Bill of Rights. This idea of not just did we have a Constitution that could protect us, but also if the government were to crush us or try to stop us from having the ability to petition, but to petition peaceably, to come together peaceably. And that's why you see this word peaceably in the Constitution. When we go further, we know that, time and time again, we have suffrage rights. And those suffrage rights could begin with 1848 and women coming together, assembling in upstate New York in order to have their own Declaration of Rights, rights to be full and equal participants in our government, in our country, but also the right to vote. And from there we have protests because there were conventions, and these suffrage conventions taking place. And one of the famous ones we know in 1851 in Akron, Ohio, in which Sojourner Truth asked the question, "Ain't I a woman?" Because these suffrage conventions were ones that were um, discriminatory against Black women who were free and also wanted equal rights, also wanted the right to vote, and all the rest of the rights that fall under full citizenship that white women wanted. And so the suffragists who were coming together came together through marches, whether or not race-based or racially separated, but they both, the African American as well as the white women, came together in marches in civil disobedience. And civil disobedience, I like to say, is fighting a law, disobeying a law for just reasons, and the law they believe, or someone or one believes, is unjust. And so civil disobedience is actually to oppose what's considered an unjust law for just reasons. And when I say an unjust law, I put quotations on unjust, and I put quotations as well on what is just, because what an unjust law to one may not be an unjust law to another. So, and what is just may be just for one, but not be just for another. And so when we start looking at civil disobedience, we're looking at protests in which a permit is not gained. So people are assembling. And Mahatma Gandhi, well, of course, from India, who was a very famous activist who fought for India to gain its independence from Great Britain, would have tens of thousands of people assemble in the middle of the day on busy streets to block traffic, once again, to bring attention to a cause, and that was the cause of independence and freedom. And so he is known for civil disobedience. I mean, we can go all the way back, to the work of Jesus and civil disobedience. There are so many ways in which civil disobedience has played a role in the world's history. But Mahatma Gandhi is known as using civil disobedience in order for this political stance for independence to be not just one that could not be ignored, but would press forward in a non-violent way. So we have peaceable assembly, but think about, it's not peaceable if you're the one in the car with tens of thousands of people blocking the street, or if you have to be the one trying to get to your home when, for example, Black Lives Matter has blocked one of the major thoroughfares. So this sense of civil disobedience also means that people can be arrested. The sit-ins, for example, that took place in many places in North Carolina, in Louisiana, and many other states during the civil rights movement, and these civil disobedience, acts of civil disobedience by these college students who went into places and sat at the diners where they were not allowed to be served because of the practice of racial discrimination, disrupting the businesses and bringing to light the inequality in that particular community, or the inequality worldwide. So you also, of course, had the anti-war protests. And the anti-war protests, every war, there's been someone either directly or indirectly protesting that war. There have always been people standing up for what they believe is just when it comes to war. And so we have, of course, the Vietnam War, more recently, the war in Afghanistan. I remember one of the first protest marches in Montgomery, Alabama, was an anti-war protest, and I know about it because I led it. And so when I received the permit, I did all of these things. And so what happens, though, when you have an assembly that's around protest, what one may say during that assembly, even though those words are not the words that people around want to hear, a protest cannot be stopped, or an assembly cannot be stopped, just because the subject matter that's being discussed or the petition that's being put forward is one with which many people disagree. And the Supreme Court has said many times that the subject cannot be the reason why police decide to end a protest or end an assembly. Once again, balancing out the rights of the people to actually talk about something that's unpopular speech. An unpopular speech does not mean that speech cannot happen. People can assemble in ways in which there's unpopular speech if what they're doing is not breaking the law and it's not causing disorder. Even if other people gather, and this happens very often, in which you have a small protest with unpopular speech, and the people who oppose the protest are maybe 2 or 3 size the time the size of those people who are actually protesting. And so if the people who oppose the protest become disruptive, they are the ones who are supposed to be arrested. And what happens too often is the people who assemble in order to put forward their petition to the government, those people are arrested to stop the outside people from causing disruption. And that undermines the constitutional right of those people who are protesting. And so the idea of civil disobedience, though, is that if one doesn't have a permit and they have not told the authorities and asked permission that, about what time, what day they're going to protest, then that protest can be ended. But there are many times in which civil disobedience protests take place because it's easier to allow the people to protest and let the protest end than cause more disruption and therefore bringing more attention and getting what the protesters wanted by arresting those protesters. I'm going to go very quickly because I know I have a discussion I want to have with Lucy and Marilyn, and I also want to have time for your questions. I want to go to freedom of association. Freedom of association is one of the sub-rights that we have within freedom of assembly. And freedom of association means that one can have a teachers association or a social workers association, the police association, any of these groups or clubs, the Boy Scouts, anything any group or where you have a consensus on a topic that is the subject with which people want to gather and discuss. If you're a part of an organization, then people are gathering for that organization. And so where are the limits, though? Here are some of the limits that came about because of freedom of association and some litigation that took place. The NAACP versus Alabama. This is a 1958 case, and it involves one of my favorite activists in the late Daisy Bates in Little Rock, Arkansas. Daisy Bates was known as the leader of those children who desegregated Central High School in Little Rock. But she also was secretary of the Little Rock NAACP. Because the Little Rock NAACP and all the other NAACP offices in Montgomery and other places had gained momentum. The NAACP was founded in 1909, and over time it had brought many cases and it lobbied the government. It had really made progress, and there was always, with a sense of progress, a backlash. And one of the ways in which the NAACP was seen as a target for backlash was a request by the Little Rock government to demand the list of members of the NAACP in Little Rock, Arkansas. They demanded this list from Daisy Bates and from North Little Rock as well, from Birdie, who was the secretary of the North Little Rock NAACP. Daisy Bates refused to give the list of members. And when you think about it now, of course we can just become members of the NAACP. I've been a member off and on of the NAACP since I was in college. But back then, the idea of being a part of this organization meant there would be not just economic repercussions, but death threats. There had been rocks thrown through Daisy Bates' window. She was, harassed constantly by telephone. There had been fire bombs thrown on her house. And so she knew that if she revealed these names, the people who were members would be attacked. They would be fired. They would be, forced out of the city. She refused to do it, and she was arrested. The case then goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court, this case went on for many, many years. It almost bankrupted the NAACP. It almost bankrupted the NAACP because the legal costs were so high. But finally, the Supreme Court ruled that the NAACP had a right to refuse to give this list to the government of Little Rock. So now go up to this past spring of 2021. Where the NAACP versus Alabama becomes the precedent for the US Supreme Court's decision in this very important case that involves freedom of association. And the freedom of association we have here is a freedom of association among donors, members of Americans for Prosperity. In California, this case is brought in the government of California. The Secretary of State wants to have the members known of the Americans for Prosperity. They want to know the donors, especially the high level donors, not the small level donors, but the high level donors. And so this case goes before the US Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice John Roberts writes the decision himself that, based on the precedent of NAACP versus Alabama, that the members of Americans for Prosperity do not have to reveal their membership. Because it's thought that they would then be harassed, because then people would ask them for money. They would know how much they were giving to conservative organizations. And because it was also known that Americans for Prosperity were part of the economic engines for a lot of these conservative agenda items for states across the country, for legislation, for cases that were being brought opposing affirmative action and other types of so-called progressive causes or liberal causes. And so the US Supreme Court then ruled that the members, to protect their association within this group of Americans for Prosperity, did not have to reveal their membership lists. And it was very interesting that they would use the civil rights case as the foundation for deciding that those people who were part of the Americans for Prosperity should be free to associate without the fear of being harassed if their names were known. Very quickly, I want to go to freedom of assembly in cyberspace. I am bringing this to you. It's something that I want to really write about at some point, but I also wonder when the court is going to be dealing with the issue of freedom of assembly on the internet. What we're doing right now on Zoom is an assembly in my mind. So if people can assemble in a chat, if people can assemble on Zoom, is that assembly, if peaceable, is it protected under the First Amendment, under freedom of assembly? The US Supreme Court has not addressed this issue yet, but I think this is going to be one for the future. And so with that, I'd like to open up to Marilyn and Lucy to actually discuss the other issues that I've raised. And I know I've gone through a great deal in a short period of time, but I was hoping that we would have questions from the audience and also have somewhat of a discussion between the three of us leading into the questions from the audience, because there are so many ways in which people assemble and so many ways in which there can be threats to that assembly, or the US Supreme Court has spoken or addressed those particular issues. And hopefully we can talk about those now. So I will stop share and go to my wonderful hosts. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Gloria. You really packed a lot in during all this. And I don't think people realize the impact that assembly has on all the other rights in the First Amendment, because obviously there's no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of assembly without freedom of speech. And I think you touched briefly on going forward. We started, talking about the suffrage movement. I thought was particularly interesting, because that was really some of the first protest movements in history that people remember or are aware of. But as you bring it closer to the civil rights era and civil disobedience, and how important do you think the civil disobedience in these protests are in affecting legislation? Would legislation be as pronounced without the civil disobedience that occurred during the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam War, and then as we move forward to the Black Lives Matter, and then capping it all off with the January 6th?
I mean, you think about Native Americans who are, assembled on land that belongs to them, but they're being told because it's owned by this corporation that they are, trespassing. And so there, once again, you have whether or not it's freedom of assembly. Whose land is it? And if people are assembling against government orders, for police orders or judges' orders, then it is civil disobedience, and in that then brings attention to the cause that has brought them there in the first place. So many times people risk jail for the fact that that's going to bring the press, and that was what Dr. Martin Luther King did so well that people don't give him credit for. He knew that if when he was there and they would as a group assemble in a place, then that the press would come, and when the press came, it would give now amplification to the cause. And so civil disobedience has been used so many times in order to bring attention to unpopular causes. Breonna Taylor, for example, during that time period in which we're still looking for justice for Breonna Taylor and so many others. And so you had people who said they're going to sit in the yard of the governor, or sit on the land of in front of City Hall. And so then laws are passed saying that this is trespassing. But once again, it brings attention to the cause. And so civil disobedience has been a major role. When you think about it, one of the reasons why the framers of the Constitution needed the assembly clause in there was because under King George, when they gathered together, it was seen as a threat. It was seen that they were, of course, planning to undermine the king, and they were in many instances, but they were also planning based on self-determination to create what they wanted to be as an independent society. And so, with many times, people who are gathered for what was seen as an unpopular topic or subject, there are laws passed to stop them from those gatherings because it's seen as something that's going to be disruptive in the future. So I think it's all very important for us to think about the ways in which people have gathered, whether legally or through civil disobedience, in order to bring attention to their cause.
May I just interject? Someone raised their hand. This is a webinar, so you have to actually type your question into the Q&A. So please do.
And I think, too, you mentioned protests against the war and something, but one of our questioners asked, what about Kent State and the violence against students? And I think being on campus yourself, you're well aware of some of the assembly that goes on, pro and con for many issues. I'm sure there was the mask issue, and people are upset when folks who are too conservative come to the campus, or too liberal come to the campus. What do you see now, talking about the Kent State and the violence against the students? How do you see students now reacting on campus? It's been difficult with the pandemic, I know, but in your experience, how important are students as far as freedom of assembly and the First Amendment?
Well, I think it's so interesting. And remember back when we were in junior high and high school, they called it assembly.
Mhm.
When we would meet, they called it, it's time for assembly. And so when
That's
you
right.
think about, yes, so when you even think about the use of the word assembly to bring together young people, but we know that on a school campus, whether or not it's a college campus or a high school campus, the younger the children, the more restrictive their behaviors can be in gathering together. Because it's seen that, when young people come together, we want to make sure they're coming together in a way that's safe. And so their clubs, for example, are usually clubs that have to be approved by the school if they're held on college campus or high school campus, on the grounds that are government or private school. They have to be approved by adults to make sure that it's not something that's going going to lead to trouble. Once again, it was early on with the sense that we have to oversee the assembly of people, grown people as well as children, to ensure that they're not getting into some type of devilment. And so when you think about the devilment going all the way back to 1608 to 1609, you can see when they're divine laws and the ways in which they're thought that if people are allowed to, come together in groups that are too large, then it becomes troublesome. And so that's why you'll even have this sense that groups can only be of a certain size, even if they're outside, because if they become too large, then the groups could break off and there could be destruction of public property, there could be harm to other people. And so there's always been this sense that you have to control human behavior, especially outside. And so when people assemble, that's the whole sense of loitering. During the time period after slavery ended, when you had the Black Codes, and the Black Codes were criminal laws that were put in place to restrict the behavior and the movements of people of African descent. It meant that you couldn't have but 2 or 3 Black people who were able to be together after sundown. This is during a time period in which people are free. And so, but if they were together, they were considered loiterers. And even today, when you see people of color, especially young people, gathered in groups, all of a sudden, the grown people will say, okay, there must be trouble. They must be trouble. We can't have these girls disperse. And I've seen police officers, after school, and the children are gathered around the school, laughing and joking and making probably far too much noise. But that's what young people do. And with those young people or people of color, I've seen many times where police have been there to make sure they get away from the school. As soon as school is out, they have to leave. In other places, probably in the suburbs, you can stop and talk to your friends. But in many places, in urban communities, it's seen as loitering. So you still have these remnants left from another time in which assembly by people of color is thought of as a dangerous thing. And I remember one time my late husband was gathering with friends. He was a Mason. And they were gathered after a meeting of the Freemasons. And he said the police came by on their bullhorns and said, okay, that's enough. And he was an accountant. Gathered with people who were public servants talking after a meeting. And yet, because they were all African Americans, there's still this sense that when certain people gather, that there must be trouble, or that we have to break it up. We can't have too many people gathering in one place. The same thing happens with unions. When you have union organizers, many times when you're gathered, and there's this sense when they're trying to create a union, we don't want to be seen with union people because there could be trouble. Or if union people who want to recruit for the union are seen in the parking lot, there are signs that you can't stay but so long, you can't assemble. I just came from the airport, from a flight that I took on Friday. You can't keep your car there but so long. You can't just assemble at the airport. There are restrictions that we're living with based on the fact that government wants to maintain order, and because there are concerns about safety. And so when it comes to assembly, you're balancing the government's concern of safety, the government's idea there could be trouble, even with protests, and whether or not the protest is a protest that has been allowed through a permit. If that protest becomes a threat to other people or a threat to property, then once again, that assembly can be stopped.
I think we have another question here, which was one that you had alluded to, but let's talk a moment about the January 6th insurrection and freedom of assembly. According to the new report of PEN America, state policymakers have introduced at least 100 proposals since June 2020 to reduce the scope of America's right to protest. And this questioner asked, and giving this an example, recent law in Florida makes it a felony to be involved in a gathering of 3 or more, which subsequently leads to violence, even if the person attending the assembly did not engage in any violent acts. Do you have a comment about this? And are you concerned that these types of proposals in certain states will be codified and stand up over time? And will it indeed impact our right to assemble?
I think even having a proposal like that impacts our right to assemble. And June 6th was not a protest. It was a lynch mob. It was a lynch mob.
Yep.
And so when we thought we know that over 5,000 people, as the officially, many more unofficially have been lynched in this country. And lynching is the kind of a diabolical, heinous murder to where we had people burned alive, we had people hanged. Many types of diabolical measures were created for murder of people in this country. And so when I saw the June 6th lynch mob, I knew it was a lynch mob by the fact that they created a gallows. So we had a gallows built on the Capitol grounds. And so that was not a protest. There could have been some people in there who thought they were just protesting, but once you start breaking in windows and scaffolding up to the top, knocking down law enforcement, that's not a protest. And anybody who believes it is delusional as far as what a protest actually is. And those people who have placed that lynch mob that took place in January 6th.
Yes,
The
January 6th, that's right.
January 6th, sorry. The lynch mob that took place on January 6th with what had taken place previously. Many people have said, well, isn't that the same as what happened with Black Lives Matter? No, it isn't. I don't recall Black Lives Matter attacking the Capitol when they protested. And so the other concern, and I'm not saying everything Black Lives Matter does falls within peaceable assembly, but what I'm saying is it is not true that what happened on January 6th was a protest that we find protected under the First Amendment. I do believe that the laws that are attempted, the bills that are being discussed to limit assembly are being created or were created well before January 6th. They were created with Black Lives Matter in mind and other civil rights protesters or even anti-war protesters. But the idea is the violation of what is considered free speech. But the other part, and the right to assemble and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. My concern then becomes, and it's like the ACLU. The ACLU supported the Nazis, neo-Nazis stance on wanting to march through or assemble in the neighborhood of Skokie, Illinois. I think we have to look at the individual situations and understand that when police became a union, the police unions were protesting in order to become police unions. When police officers want a raise, they find ways to protest. So when we talk about cutting rights off for one group in particular, we have to realize that there's always a balance or maybe an imbalance that's put in place. Because three people gathered together, and there was something very similar that was taking place here in Nassau County, in which there was this sense that if people gathered together and then there was some act of violence that came out of that, then there would be criminal consequences for all involved. It didn't matter if they weren't even part of that or had no intention. But that's called a chilling effect. And a chilling effect is chilling the rights of people so that they are afraid to exercise their due constitutional rights. And so I believe that the U.S. Supreme Court would not support these laws. But once again, it requires that people spend time, money, and energy to take cases up to the U.S. Supreme Court to maintain and protect their rights under the Constitution.
Gloria, you also talked about subjectivity and enforcing assembly, and there really isn't anything other than the First Amendment that says, you may protest peacefully, not violently, and so forth and so on. But it seems that state by state, it's very different how they enforce freedom of the rules concerning freedom of assembly. What can be done about that? Is there anything universal that can be taken care of? I mean, like what there was with the Voting Rights Act, much of which has been disbanded. But how does one take away the subjectivity of that?
Well, it has to be through the U.S. Supreme Court or through federal legislation. And the Supreme Court has actually spoken very clearly under the Supremacy Clause of Article 6. The federal law is the law of the land. So or the supreme law of the land. And even if states disagree, if federal legislation is passed or if the Supreme Court speaks on this issue of assembly and protecting broadly freedom of assembly, the states must reconcile their laws to that. And so they can perhaps, be disgruntled. They can keep bringing these actions that then once again require someone to oppose them. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court for the Supreme Court to say that this law is unconstitutional. It's very difficult, I think, for the Congress to pass laws that will protect freedom of assembly, because they're thought to want to protect the right for certain groups to assemble and undermine the rights for other groups to assemble, depending on where they are on the party line. And so it would be very difficult for Congress to come up with something that would appease both sides of the aisle. And that's why I think it's usually something that's left to the U.S. Supreme Court to decide that a particular state law is unconstitutional. Unfortunately, while the case is making its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, the damage is being done while the law is in force. And that means that it has that chilling effect in which people are afraid to actually assemble, because when they do peaceably even assemble, there's this sense of subjectivity that someone could be outraged by the reason for the coming together, and the reason that they've gathered in the first place, the coming together of certain people. No other right. It doesn't say that they have to peaceably exercise their freedom of religion. It doesn't say they have to peaceably use the press. It's only with assembly that they decided, and so much of the Constitution is a compromise. The Constitution is a compromise document. And so there must have been some compromise in which peaceably was supposed to allow individuals to assemble, but not be a threat to the government. I would like to end with this last point. And this last point is freedom of assembly, whether or not it's on the internet, as we are assembled right now and have a right to do so, we assume. But when we start thinking about the right to assemble, whether or not it was in person in the 1600s or by cyberspace now, we have to use many times someone else's platform. So can we be denied the fact that we want to go on Zoom to have this discussion? This is what we need to start thinking about. Can people then, and that's what you're seeing on Facebook, the idea that people are having their access to the platform limited because of the topic or the unpopularity of the speech that's being discussed while they're coming together. So we need to pay attention to the censorship that's taking place. Once we know that if it balances off on one side, the other side could also be harmed in ways in which no one envisioned at the time. So as we use these platforms on social media, these are gatherings, these are assemblies, and we're gathering peaceably, but it could be the speech, the topic about which we're discussing on these platforms that could be the next level of censorship that will then be undermined by legislation.
Well, Dr. Browne-Marshall, I want to thank you very much for educating us about one of the things that are so important to us today, and bringing a historical perspective to it, which I think many of us really did not understand how early and how important it was, dating back to the 1600s. Again, I urge you all to pick up one of or two or three of Dr. Browne-Marshall's books. Look for the virtual stage play, Dreams of Emmett Till, which is extraordinary. Thank you all again for tuning in today. And thank you very much, Gloria, for everything that you do for the Constitution and ensuring that it's upheld. So again, Lucy, we want to remind folks that our final program in the series is October 10th. And folks can go to the library and check it out. And thank you all so much for being here this evening, and especially to you, Dr. Browne-Marshall. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you all.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Bye.